Cluster sampling. In this presentation, I will go over cluster sampling and the things you should know about this sampling technique. What is a cluster sample? First of all, let's define what a cluster is. Clusters are the smaller groups divided from a population that you will take from a sample. So, we have a cluster sample when a population is first divided into heterogeneous groups. Next, an entire group or groups are randomly chosen and everyone in the group or groups are part of the sample. This kind of sample is usually done by location, for example by state or neighborhood. Cluster sampling steps. Now, there are many different steps you can follow when taking a cluster sample. However, cluster sampling usually involves 4 key steps, so for this presentation, we're going to stick with those 4. Number 1, define your population. Number 2, divide your sample into clusters. Number 3, randomly select clusters to use in your sample. And number 4, collect your data from the samples. So, when do I use a cluster sample? Cluster samples are helpful with data sets of large populations, and they're most often used when we are unable to get information about the population as a whole. For example, if I were interested in gasoline prices in Florida, then I may choose various cities throughout the state for my sample, since the entire state of Florida is too large to account for every single city and town. In this sample, each city would represent an individual cluster that I would then use to represent the price of gas in the state of Florida. Things to note. There are 2 different types of cluster sampling. Number 1, single-stage cluster sampling. This is when all the elements in each selected cluster are used. Number 2, two-stage cluster sampling. This is when a random sampling technique is applied to the selected clusters. For example, once you've decided on your clusters, you could use simple random sampling to select your sample. Now, it's good to know that there are different techniques you could use, but for this presentation, we're just going to focus on single-stage cluster sampling. And another thing, don't confuse cluster sampling and stratified random sampling. In cluster sampling, a researcher will only study the selected clusters. With stratified sampling, a random sample is drawn from each strata. I'm not going to go into great detail right now, but the 2 are very similar, so don't confuse them. Now, let's try an example. Use a cluster sample to find the average reading level of all the 7th graders in your city. So, let's go back to our 4 steps. Number 1, define the population. Our population is all the 7th graders in your city. Number 2, divide the sample into clusters. Our clusters, the 7th graders are grouped by the school they attend. Number 3, randomly select clusters to use in the sample. In this case, our clusters will be in different schools throughout the city. Assign each school a number and use a random number generator to randomly select the clusters for your example, the schools. And finally, number 4, collect your data from the samples. So, we will test the reading levels of all the 7th graders in the schools that you randomly selected. The data you get from your sample will be the average reading level of the 7th graders in the city. There, we have just used the cluster sampling method. Thank you for watching this presentation.